Okay, in this short video I will be focusing on architecture photography this time and looking specifically at six key ideas or principles that relate to that genre of photography. So architecture photography is photography of architecture. Architecture is typically buildings or structures or built structures, designed and built structures. And architecture photography is photography that seeks to accentuate or bring emphasis or attention to those aesthetically pleasing design elements. Aesthetically pleasing means like looking good. So if there is a building an interesting shaped building, then an architecture photographer would seek not just to take a photo of that building, but to take a photo of that building that emphasizes that interesting shape or that interesting feature that building has that makes it unique. So all buildings, typically good architecture, will have some sort of unique feature or shape or thing about them, and an architecture photographer taking a photograph of that building would seek to accentuate that interesting feature. So architecture photography is architecture which involves structures, which could be buildings, could be the exteriors of buildings, could be the interiors of buildings, could be bridges, other structures, could be whole cityscapes. But an architecture photographer, as an architecture photographer, your goal is not just to take a pretty picture of a structure, but to draw attention to those aesthetically pleasing or interesting features, design features of that structure. So in order to do this, you need to be aware of six key principles. These are the perspective, the shape and line, the contrast color, the lighting, the composition, and the exposure settings. So when we're talking about perspective in relation to architecture photography, there's two sort of ways you can go about it. One is to have to shoot a structure from a perspective that makes the structure appear natural, so i.e. this one here. So these are all images of Big Ben. So in order to take this image here, the photographer was most probably over here on the opposite side of the Thames River, whichever river that is, from a long distance away using a long focal length. So you go from when you stand further away from something and you zoom in, it has the effect of looking like this. You've all been to the city, right? And when you look up at a building and it looks like this, that's when you're really close to it and you're looking up. But if you walk a kilometer away from that building and then you look at it again, it looks like that, because your perspective is affected by the distance that you are away from that building or subject. So in order to have a flat looking perspective, like a natural looking perspective like this one, you need to stand further away and zoom in on using a longer focal length. But if you wanted to use a perspective create a perspective like this one, then you'd need to be closer to your subject and using a wider focal length to fit it in the frame. I just threw this one in there, I think, for context. This would be an acceptable. This is architecture photography for sure. This is architecture photography for sure, because it accentuates the height of the building in a sort of a way that still has a pleasing composition. But this image is not really anything that I would write home about. This one here is an interesting one as well. In order to take this photo, obviously you're going to have to be quite a way away. So you're going to have to be, this far away to get this perspective. So you're going to have quite a long focal length and a powerful camera to be able to zoom in to the point where you can actually take a completely zoomed in photo of the face of the clock. So that's just another way to so it's about working out. Perspective is about working out, do you want to have a natural looking perspective like this, or do you want to accentuate? When we're talking about accentuating a feature of the building, is it more appropriate to create an interesting perspective by standing closer to the building? So understanding the distance away from the building and how that affects the perspective and the way the image will end up. So another important part of architecture photography is the emphasis. So when, as I said, you're emphasizing a interesting feature of that building. So quite often that'll be interesting shapes or interesting lines that appear in the design of that exterior or the interior of the building. So here we've got some examples of some interesting shapes and lines on the interior of like a stairwell inside some sort of building. Same again here. The shape that those interesting shapes and those interesting lines and how they work together and interact together to create this structural thing. And the architecture photographer is seeking to emphasize that in the way that they take that photo. So this image here, we can sort of gauge that this is the exterior facade of a building, so the outside face of a building, part of the outside face of a building. So if I was to stand a whole lot further back and include the whole building in the frame, imagine that it goes up here, up the top, and then comes down, then there's a bit more here. Would that have the same effect? Maybe not. The reason why this is such a powerful image is because it's zoomed in and it's showing just a portion that's relevant to that image. Same here, we can imagine that if you were standing there, you'd probably see a whole lot more than just what's shown in the frame here. But the photographer has limited our view to just this portion of the structure of that building because he wants to, or she wants to, or whoever wants to accentuate that shape and that line in that design feature that they've found in this piece of architecture. So in addition to that, an architecture photographer might choose to accentuate or emphasize the color or an interesting color feature or the contrast of that structure. So if the building itself has like an interesting color feature, like a yellow under balcony, whatever you want to call it, under awning, or like interesting paint on the wall or other sort of interesting color effects, then accentuating that or emphasizing that might be a useful tool when taking photos of architecture. But if not, so say you might not be familiar with this building, but it's a famous building in New York called the Flatiron Building, and it's famous for its shape, but I wouldn't say the look of it is anything fantastic. The color is just sort of it's just grey. It's like a grey concrete building with just plain coloured windows. The shape is what makes it iconic. So if you were the photographer of this building, you wouldn't obviously be trying to emphasize the color of that building because there's not a whole lot to be said about the color of that building. And maybe same here, maybe this building here is just your typical steel structure with some blue windows, and that itself might not be that interesting. So the photographers seek to bring out some of the other features of that building by making the image a high contrast image. So black and white obviously will make an image high contrast, but also the lighting and the way they've chosen to shoot the image depending on where the sun or the light source might be at the time. And that really brings out those shadows and those darker parts of the image in contrast to the lighter parts of the image. Which brings us to the next part, which is lighting. So an architecture photographer has to be acutely aware of the lighting and the sources of light, the forms of light, and the effect that they have in their image. So for instance, if we look at this example here, it might be a typical example out on a sunny day, bright sky, clouds, find an interesting building and play off some reflection effects with that, the glass facade of that building. Another option might be to shoot later at night or at dusk when the lights of the building start to turn on. Then you get all these interesting colors and you're able to see inside the building itself. So that's another way of incorporating light, architectural light, into your image. Another one is to shoot indoors during a sunny day or a bright day when there's enough light from the exterior coming inside the building and creating shadows and interesting shapes as the lights come in and create shadows bouncing off of different parts of the walls. And finally, another option is to even shoot at nighttime. With a slow enough shutter speed, you could shoot on the darkest night. It just means you have to have a slower shutter speed essentially. So you're gonna have to use a tripod. So for instance, I'm guessing this photo was taken at nighttime. This light source is the moon. So the camera would have been on a tripod, and they would have waited till the moon was about here somewhere, and then they could have taken this photo using a, I don't know, 10 maybe even 30 seconds, probably a 30-second shutter speed, and that would be long enough that the moon wouldn't really move any visible amount, but would create this sort of milky effect around the outside, and you get that effect, that silhouette effect, with the light source, moon, but it could be the sun, behind the building itself, and that would work fine at daytime as well. You just have a faster shutter speed. So being aware of what the light source is it the sun, is it the moon, is it a reflection off of a window, is it coming in through cracks in windows, is it light from inside the building itself? So being aware of these light sources and being aware of how they're going to affect your image and how you can play off those effects to create interesting effects. So next is composition. As always, we're always aware of our composition, and not just taking a silly photo of a building, but trying to think about those composition techniques, because they are useful and famous for a reason. The reason why we use these composition techniques is because they have been tested and they're known to have a visually appealing effect, and are found comfortable and appealing to the viewer. So one we see quite a lot is repetition and pattern, like this one here. We can see, the photographer is wanting to accentuate that interesting shape in the balcony and the repetitive effect of it. So just standing from a distance and just taking a photo of the whole building might not accentuate that fact, but you choosing to limit the frame to just those balconies creates that repetitive and pattern-like composition to this image, and that has a much more powerful effect, and it accentuates the feature that they're seeking to accentuate. Same with this one here, we've got pattern again. We've also got a little bit of rule of thirds going on, with that line sort of falling in that top sort of portion of the image. And then we've got this image here, we've got a bit of symmetry going on, we've got a bit of leading lines going on. You could probably even say that we've got a bit of pattern going on with this repetitive like window effect. So yeah, and then same here, we've got symmetry, we've got patterns, we've probably even got a tiny bit of leading lines going on as well. So even rule of thirds, the way that's positioned in that frame. So we're starting to see that rule of thirds, pattern, leading lines, and symmetry are some quite common compositions that are used in architecture photography. And I mean, you can get creative and use all of them, framing, whatever else you can think of. Juxtaposition is used a bit too. But just being aware that you're trying to compose your image in a way and not just take a photo of something. And finally, exposure settings is another thing to consider. So as I mentioned before about shutter speed, that's mainly determined by the time of day that you're shooting, because if it's a bright sunny day like this, then you're not going to be able to do a 30-second shutter speed without sort of additional equipment, because the image is just going to be overexposed. So you have to, so in this case, you're going to have a faster shutter speed, and you're going to have frozen. So on a cloudy day, you're going to have clouds in the sky that are frozen there. Whereas if you were to use a slower shutter speed, those clouds would start to blur and create like a milky effect, like this image here. So in order to create this image here, you'd have to be either shooting at nighttime, where there's less light and it's not going to become overexposed. So then the clouds, I mean, you can't really see it in this case, but it creates that milkier effect where that's a blurred out sort of sky, and the light on the building is not as defined, it's milkier, and the shadows are a little bit more blended. So you get that sort of surreal effect when you do slow shutter speed images of buildings like that. Or it could be shot during the daytime, but using a filter, where essentially it's essentially like putting sunglasses on your camera, putting a dark screen on the lens so that it limits how much light comes in. But if you don't have that technology, then you're better off trying to shoot at nighttime or later in the evening when there's less light. So slow shutter speeds, but you have to have less light in the sky is a good form of architecture photography if you want to create this sort of effect. The other thing you need to think about is depth of field. Really, most of the time you're going to be using a large depth of field because buildings are large structures and you want to have basically as much of it as possible in focus, like this image here, all the way from the front all the way to the back in focus with a large depth of field. But if there's some sort of stylistic effect you want to create, like this one here, whether you've used a shallow depth of field to have the front part of the image in focus but the back part of the image out of focus, then that can be another creative way of accentuating a feature of a design feature of a structural thing. And as said, that's what design architecture photography is all about. It's about accentuating those interesting design features. So just to recap, we had the perspective, are we close or far away from the subject, and how that will affect the image. The shape, if the building has interesting shapes and lines, then we should seek to accentuate them. If they have interesting colors, then we should accentuate them. But if all else fails, we can always create a high contrast image. Lighting, we need to be aware of what our light source is and how it affects the image and how we can use that to create to heighten the effects of our image. We're always being aware of the composition of our images and trying to incorporate as many elements of composition as we can. And we are aware of the exposure settings and how they affect the image, and making those creative decisions based on the depth of field or the shutter speed of the image. So those are the 6 key concepts of architecture photography. As I've said before, many of those interlock with some of the other genres that we're looking at. So if you want to gain a better understanding of any of them individually, then please watch some of those other videos. Otherwise, thanks for watching this one. Bye.